The toilet in cell 138 hadn't worked properly in weeks. Guards walked past it every day, hearing the constant dripping, the occasional clang of metal on porcelain. They thought it was just another broken fixture in America's most infamous prison. They were wrong. What they didn't know was that beneath that toilet, a prisoner was digging his way to freedom, one chip of concrete at a time. This is the story of how one man turned a prison toilet into an escape route from Alcatraz, the island fortress that was supposed to be impossible to escape from. Before we dive into this incredible story, if you're fascinated by prison escapes and true crime, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We cover the most shocking prison stories that most people never hear about. Now, let's get into how this escape actually happened. The prisoner. His name was John Paul Scott, prisoner number AZ-1403. He arrived at Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary in 1959, convicted of bank robbery. But Scott wasn't your typical bank robber. He was a planner, a thinker, someone who studied patterns and found weaknesses where others saw only walls. Alcatraz wasn't Scott's first rodeo. He'd already escaped from a Kentucky prison years before, only to be caught and sent somewhere even more secure. The federal government had a problem with men like Scott, men who refused to stay locked up. So they sent him to the Rock, the island prison in San Francisco Bay that had never had a successful escape in its 29 years of operation. At least, that's what everyone believed. The fortress. Alcatraz sat on a 12-acre island, surrounded by freezing water and deadly currents. The prison housed America's most dangerous criminals, the ones who'd caused problems everywhere else. The federal government spent millions making it escape-proof. Guard towers watched every angle. Barbed wire covered every fence. And the San Francisco Bay itself served as the ultimate barrier. Its waters so cold that hypothermia would kill you in minutes. The prison administration had a saying, break the rules and you go to prison. Break prison rules and you come to Alcatraz. Cell 138 sat in B Block, one of the main cell houses. It measured 5 feet by 9 feet. Inside was a sink, a toilet, a full-down bed, and barely enough room to turn around. The walls were solid concrete, reinforced with steel bars. The door was made of tool-proof steel. Every cell was designed to contain men who'd proven they could escape from anywhere else. But John Paul Scott saw something the architects missed. The partnership. Scott wasn't working alone. His cellmate was Darrell D. Parker, prisoner AZ-1413, also in for bank robbery. Parker was younger, more impulsive, but he had something Scott needed, desperation. Parker couldn't stand the thought of spending another decade on the Rock. That desperation made him willing to take risks that most men wouldn't consider. The two men had been watching, studying, learning the patterns of Alcatraz for months. They knew when guards made their rounds. They knew which guards were thorough and which ones were lazy. They knew that on December nights, fog rolled in so thick that you couldn't see 10 feet in front of you. And they knew that cell 138 had a toilet that kept breaking down. The discovery. It started with a crack. Scott noticed it one day while sitting on the toilet, a hairline fracture in the concrete floor near the base. Most prisoners wouldn't have given it a second thought. But Scott wasn't most prisoners. He pressed his thumb against the crack. The concrete moved just slightly. It was old, weakened by decades of moisture and temperature changes. The prison had been built in the 1930s, and the harsh salt air had been eating away at the infrastructure ever since. That night, Scott lay in his bunk and thought about that crack. The toilet drain, he realized, didn't just go down into the prison's plumbing. It had to go somewhere, had to connect to pipes that eventually led outside the cell, outside the building, maybe even outside the prison walls. He shared his discovery with Parker. They both knew what it meant, a possibility. A tiny, dangerous, almost impossible possibility, but a possibility nonetheless. The plan takes shape. Over the next weeks, Scott and Parker developed their plan. It was audacious, ridiculous even. They would chip away at the concrete around the toilet, creating a hole large enough to squeeze through. Then they'd navigate the prison's utility corridors, find a way to the exterior wall, and somehow get past the razor wire and guard towers. And then they'd swim through the freezing waters of San Francisco Bay in December at night. They'd swim nearly 2 miles to shore, through currents that had drowned better swimmers than them. It was a suicide mission. But staying in Alcatraz felt like death too, just slower. They needed tools. In Alcatraz, tools were watched more carefully than the prisoners themselves. Every wrench was inventoried. Every screwdriver was counted. But Scott and Parker had something the guards didn't account for: time and patience. Parker worked in the prison kitchen. Over months, he stole pieces of wire, small bits of metal, anything that could be sharpened or shaped. Scott, meanwhile, worked on making their digging invisible. He needed the hole to look like normal deterioration, like the toilet was just falling apart on its own. The beauty of their plan was its simplicity. Alcatraz's toilets broke down constantly. The salt water corroded the pipes. The old plumbing failed regularly. When Scott reported that his toilet was leaking worse than usual, the guards barely looked at it. They just added it to the maintenance list and moved on. That indifference would prove fatal to the prison's perfect record. The work begins. The digging started in October 1962. Scott and Parker worked only at night, during the hours when the prison was quietest. They'd wait until the guards' footsteps faded down the corridor. Then Scott would drop to the floor beside the toilet and begin chipping away at the concrete. The noise was their biggest problem. Every tap of metal against concrete echoed in the small cell. But they'd thought of that too. Parker would cough loudly and repeatedly, covering the sound of Scott's work. Or they'd wait for the foghorns in the bay, using those deep blasts to mask their digging. They worked in 15-minute intervals. 15 minutes of careful, quiet chipping. Then stop, listen, wait. If a guard came by, Scott would be back in his bunk, Parker sitting on the toilet as if nothing was happening. The concrete came away in small chunks at first. Scott used a sharpened piece of wire to scrape away the material, letting it fall into the toilet bowl, where he could flush it away. He worked by feel in the darkness, his fingers learning the contours of the growing hole. Progress was agonizingly slow. After a week of work, the hole was barely 6 inches wide. At that rate, it would take months to create an opening large enough to squeeze through. But they had no choice except to keep going. The close calls. 3 weeks into the digging, a guard stopped outside cell 138 during a routine count. Scott was in his bunk, but the floor around the toilet was dusty with concrete powder. The guard shined his flashlight through the bars, the beam sweeping across the cell. Scott held his breath. If the guard looked closely at the toilet, if he noticed the disturbed concrete, everything would be over. The guard's flashlight beam paused on the toilet for what felt like an eternity. Then it moved on. The guard continued down the corridor. Scott exhaled slowly. Parker was shaking in the bunk below. They realized they needed to be more careful about cleaning up. After every digging session, they'd use water from the sink to wash away any trace of concrete dust. They'd flush the toilet repeatedly, making sure no evidence remained in the bowl. They'd even learn to time their work with the prison's own maintenance, so that if a guard did notice something, it would blend in with the general deterioration of the aging facility. Breaking through. By late November, the hole was nearly 2 feet wide. Scott could fit his arm through it, reaching down into the darkness below. He felt pipes, cold metal conduits, running beneath the cell. The space below was larger than he'd hoped, a utility crawl space that ran the length of the cell block. This was the gap in Alcatraz's armor. The prison had been designed to contain prisoners in their cells, but the architects had underestimated how far desperate men would go. They'd assumed the concrete floors were secure, that no one would think to dig through a toilet. They were wrong. On December 14, 1962, Scott made the final break. The hole was now large enough for a man to squeeze through, though barely. He'd have to go headfirst, sliding down into the crawl space below, with no guarantee he could even turn around once he was down there. The point of no return was approaching. Once they went through that hole, there was no coming back. If they got stuck in the crawl space, they'd die there. If they were caught escaping, they'd spend years in solitary confinement. If they made it to the water but couldn't survive the swim, they'd drown in the freezing bay. But if they stayed in cell 138, they'd rot away behind these bars until they were old men or dead. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. The final preparations. They planned their escape for December 16th, a Sunday night. The weather forecast predicted heavy fog, which would reduce visibility for the guard towers. The tide charts showed a current that flowed toward shore rather than out to the Pacific, giving them their best chance of making it to land. Scott and Parker gathered what little they could carry. They fashioned crude water wings from stolen rubber gloves, inflating them and tying them together. They weren't much, but in the freezing water, they might provide just enough buoyancy to keep their heads above water. They also made crude life preservers from their prison uniform shirts, tying the arms and stuffing them with anything that might float. Again, it wasn't much, but it was all they had. The night before the escape, neither man slept. They lay in their bunks, listening to the sounds of Alcatraz at night. The distant foghorns, the footsteps of guards on patrol, the coughs and snores of other prisoners, the metallic clangs of pipes expanding and contracting with temperature changes. Scott thought about the outside world, about freedom. He'd spent so much of his adult life behind bars that he sometimes struggled to remember what it felt like to make his own choices, to walk more than a few feet in any direction, to see the horizon without bars blocking the view. Tomorrow night, one way or another, that would change. December 16th, 1962. The day passed with excruciating slowness. Scott and Parker went through their normal routines, terrified that any deviation might alert the guards that something was wrong. They ate their meals. They participated in recreation time. They returned to their cell for the evening count. At 5:30 p.m., the prison locked down for the night. Cell doors clanged shut across B Block. Lights dimmed. The overnight guards began their rounds. Scott and Parker waited. They waited through the 6 p.m. count. They waited through the 7 p.m. rounds. They waited until 9 p.m., when the prison settled into its deepest quiet. Outside, the fog rolled in from the Pacific, thick and heavy, wrapping Alcatraz in a cold, wet blanket. Perfect. At 9:17 p.m., Scott dropped to the floor beside the toilet. He gripped the edges of the hole he'd spent 2 months creating. He looked up at Parker one last time. "See you on the other side," Scott whispered. Then he lowered himself headfirst into the darkness below. This is where everything changes. But before we continue, if you want to see more impossible prison escapes and incredible survival stories, make sure you're subscribed and hit that like button. It really helps us bring you these stories. Now, let's see if Scott and Parker actually make it out. Into the crawl space. The drop was shorter than Scott expected, maybe 5 feet. He landed on his shoulders in the cramped space below the cell, his body twisted at an awkward angle. For a terrifying moment, he thought he was stuck, that the space was too small to maneuver in. But then he managed to turn his head, then his shoulders, slowly contorting his body until he was right side up. The crawl space was about 3 feet high, barely enough room to crawl. Pipes ran along the ceiling, some hot to the touch, others dripping with condensation. Above him, he heard Parker beginning his descent. Scott crawled forward to make room, his hands splashing through puddles of stagnant water. The smell down here was overwhelming, a mixture of mildew, rust, and human waste from decades of prison plumbing. Parker landed with a grunt, immediately starting to panic in the confined space. "I can't breathe," he gasped. "There's no air down here." "Quiet," Scott hissed. "There's air. Just breathe slowly." They waited a moment, listening. Above them, the prison continued its normal rhythms. No alarms, no shouts, No one had noticed their absence yet. But they would eventually. The guards did bed checks throughout the night, shining flashlights into each cell to count heads. Scott and Parker had maybe 4 or 5 hours before someone realized cell 138 was empty. They had to be off the island by then. The utility corridors. Scott led the way through the crawl space, navigating by feel in the near-total darkness. He tried to memorize the layout of Alcatraz's infrastructure from old blueprints he'd seen in the prison library, but down here in the dark, everything looked different. They crawled through water and grime, occasionally hitting dead ends where pipes blocked their path. Each time, they'd have to backtrack and find another route. The crawl space was a maze of concrete, metal, and darkness. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, they reached a larger space. Scott could hear the sound of machinery, the hum of generators. They'd reached some kind of mechanical room beneath the main prison building. Here, they could stand upright for the first time. Both men stretched, their backs aching from crawling. Scott pulled out a small piece of metal he'd sharpened to a point, their only weapon if they encountered a guard. The mechanical room had several doors. Scott tried the first one locked. The second one also locked. The third one opened, revealing a concrete stairway leading up. They climbed carefully, each step bringing them closer to either freedom or capture. At the top of the stairs was another door. Scott pressed his ear against it, listening. He heard nothing. He turned the handle. The door opened. They were outside. The prison grounds. The fog was even thicker than they'd hoped, a wall of gray that swallowed everything beyond a few feet. Scott and Parker crept along the side of the building, keeping to the shadows even though the fog provided plenty of cover. They could hear the guard towers, could hear the faint conversations of board guards on night duty. But the fog was so thick that the guards couldn't see anything. Scott and Parker were invisible. They navigated by memory and luck, moving toward where they thought the perimeter fence should be. Every step was terrifying. At any moment, a guard could appear out of the fog. At any moment, an alarm could sound. But the alarm didn't sound. The guards stayed in their towers. After 10 minutes of careful movement, they reached the fence. It was 12 feet high, topped with barbed wire, and beyond it was another fence. And beyond that was the rocky shore and the bay. They'd prepared for this. Using their primitive tools and their prison uniforms as padding, they scaled the first fence. The barbed wire tore into their clothes and skin, but they pushed through. Then the second fence, more climbing, more pain. And then they were on the rocks, the dark water of San Francisco Bay stretching out before them. The swim. The water was shocking, even colder than they'd imagined. Scott gasped as he lowered himself in, feeling his muscles seize up from the temperature. The water was maybe 50 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to cause hypothermia in less than an hour. Parker hesitated on the rocks, staring at the water. "I can't do this," he said. "It's too cold. I'll die out there." "You'll die in Alcatraz," Scott replied. "At least this way we have a chance." Parker looked back at the prison, invisible in the fog, but still there, still waiting to swallow them again. Then he jumped. The current was stronger than they'd anticipated. Despite their research, despite their planning, the bay was fighting them. The makeshift flotation devices helped, but barely. Within minutes, both men were already exhausted, their muscles burning from the cold and the effort of swimming. Scott could barely feel his arms and legs. The cold was like knives stabbing into every part of his body. He kept swimming, kept pushing forward, even as his mind started to slow down, even as hypothermia began to set in. He couldn't see the shore. He couldn't see Parker. He couldn't see anything except fog and dark water. He had no idea if he was swimming toward San Francisco or out into the Pacific Ocean. He just kept swimming. The crossing. Time lost all meaning in the freezing water. It might have been 20 minutes or 2 hours. Scott's arms moved mechanically, driven by instinct rather than conscious thought. His body temperature was dropping rapidly. He knew that soon he'd simply stop being able to move, would slip beneath the surface and drown. But something kept him going. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was the memory of his cell, the thought of going back to that 5 by 9 foot box. Maybe it was just the basic human drive to survive. He bumped into something hard. Rocks. He'd reached the shore. Scott tried to pull himself out of the water, but his arms wouldn't work. He was shaking so violently that he couldn't coordinate his movements. He managed to get his head and shoulders onto the rocks, but that was all. He lay there, half in the water, half out, unable to move any further. He'd made it. He'd actually escaped from Alcatraz, the prison that was supposed to be impossible to escape from. He was the first prisoner in the history of the facility to successfully reach the San Francisco shore. But he was dying. The hypothermia was too severe. Without immediate help, he'd freeze to death on these rocks within the hour. The discovery. 2 teenagers were walking along the shore of Fort Point, just below the Golden Gate Bridge. It was late, nearly midnight, and they were out past curfew. They were laughing about something when one of them spotted what looked like a body on the rocks. "Holy shit," one said. "Is that a person?" They scrambled down to the water's edge. Scott was barely conscious, his skin blue white, his body convulsing with shivers. His prison uniform was torn and soaked through. "He's alive," the other teenager said. "Call the police. Call an ambulance." Scott tried to speak, tried to tell them to leave him alone, that he'd rather die free than go back to Alcatraz. But his mouth wouldn't form words. His jaw was locked from the cold. Within 10 minutes, police and ambulances arrived. They pulled Scott fully onto the shore, wrapped him in blankets, began treating him for severe hypothermia. He was barely alive, his core body temperature dangerously low. "Where did you come from?" a police officer asked. Scott, his mind clearing slightly with the warmth of the blankets, managed to whisper 2 words: "The Rock." The officer's eyes widened. No one escaped from Alcatraz. It was impossible. And yet here was a man in prison clothes, frozen half to death, claiming he'd just swum from the island. The police immediately contacted Alcatraz. The prison confirmed that yes, 2 prisoners were missing from cell 138. Yes, there appeared to be a hole in the floor beneath the toilet. Yes, for the first time in the prison's history, someone had actually escaped. Parker's fate. But what about Darrell D. Parker? He'd entered the water at the same time as Scott. He'd started swimming toward freedom. Unlike Scott, Parker never made it to shore. Search teams found his body the next morning, floating face down about a mile from Alcatraz. He'd drowned, succumbing to the freezing water and the exhaustion. He'd gotten so close to freedom, had survived the impossible escape from the prison itself, only to die within sight of the San Francisco shore. His body was pulled from the bay and returned to Alcatraz for identification. He'd spent his last moments swimming toward freedom, feeling the cold water drag him down, knowing that he'd almost made it. Almost. Scott's recovery and return. John Paul Scott spent 2 days in the hospital, recovering from severe hypothermia and exposure. His body temperature had dropped to 92 degrees Fahrenheit when he was found, just a few degrees away from death. Doctors said if he'd been in the water 10 more minutes, he wouldn't have survived. But survive he did, and once he'd recovered enough to be moved, he was taken back to Alcatraz in handcuffs. The escape through the toilet had worked. The swim across the bay had worked. Scott had achieved what was supposed to be impossible. He'd broken out of America's most secure prison and reached the mainland. But he was going back anyway. The irony wasn't lost on Scott. He'd survived the escape that killed his partner. He'd done what no other Alcatraz prisoner had managed to do. And his reward was a return to the same cell, the same bars, the same 5 by 9 foot cage. Except the toilet hole was sealed now. That route was closed forever. The investigation, the escape sent shockwaves through the federal prison system. How had 2 prisoners managed to dig through concrete for 2 months without anyone noticing? How had they navigated the utility corridors? How had they gotten past the fences and guard towers? The investigation revealed a cascade of failures. Guards who'd been too lazy to properly inspect cells. Maintenance requests that had been ignored or delayed. Aging infrastructure that was literally falling apart. A security culture that had become complacent because no one had successfully escaped in 29 years. The toilet in cell 138 had been reported as broken multiple times. Guards had walked past it every day, hearing it leak, seeing the water damage around the base. But no one had looked closely enough to see that the damage wasn't natural deterioration, but deliberate excavation. Alcatraz's reputation as the inescapable prison had been built on the idea that the bay itself was the ultimate security measure. The prison administration had assumed that even if someone got out of their cell, even if they reached the water, they'd never survive the swim. Scott had proven them wrong. The swim was survivable barely, but survivable. The myth of Alcatraz's perfect security was shattered. Changes and closure. In the wake of Scott and Parker's escape, Alcatraz implemented new security measures. More frequent cell inspections. Better maintenance protocols. Additional guards on night patrol. The prison tightened every procedure, closed every gap. But it was too late. The escape had exposed fundamental problems with the facility. The buildings were deteriorating. The costs of maintenance were skyrocketing. And most importantly, the psychological advantage of housing prisoners somewhere they believed was impossible to escape from had been lost. Less than a year after Scott's escape, in March 1963, the federal government announced that Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary would be closed. The official reason was the high operational costs, but everyone knew the truth. The myth of Alcatraz had died the night John Paul Scott dove through a toilet hole and swam to freedom. The prison closed its doors forever on March 21, 1963. Its remaining prisoners were transferred to other facilities. The island was left abandoned, eventually becoming a tourist attraction rather than a working prison. What happened to Scott? John Paul Scott was transferred to other federal prisons after Alcatraz closed. He served additional time for the escape attempt, including months in solitary confinement as punishment. He was eventually released in the 1970s, having served his sentence. He lived quietly, rarely speaking about his time in Alcatraz or his famous escape. In the few interviews he gave, he was asked if he regretted the escape attempt, given that he'd been recaptured anyway. His answer was always the same: "I'd rather have one night of freedom than a lifetime of wondering if I could have made it." Scott died in 1987, a free man. His name went down in history as the only prisoner to successfully escape Alcatraz and reach the mainland alive, even if his freedom only lasted a few hours. The legacy. Today, tourists visit Alcatraz by the thousands, walking through the same cell blocks where Scott and Parker once lived. Cell 138 is still there, its toilet replaced, but the hole beneath it now sealed with steel-reinforced concrete. Tour guides tell the story of the escape through the toilet, how two desperate men found a weakness in America's most secure prison. They talk about the impossible swim, about Parker's death in the bay, about Scott's miraculous survival. The escape inspired movies, books, and countless other prison break stories. It became part of American criminal folklore, a testament to human ingenuity and determination in the face of impossible odds. But beyond the legend and the tourism, the escape raises deeper questions. What drives a man to dig through concrete with improvised tools for 2 months? What makes someone willing to swim through freezing water in December, knowing they'll probably die? What is freedom worth? For John Paul Scott, the answer was clear: everything. Freedom was worth the months of backbreaking work, worth the risk of drowning, worth the certainty of punishment if he failed. The 5-by-9-foot cell was a kind of death, and even a slim chance at life was better than the certainty of that slow dying. The toilet that changed history. In the end, it all came down to a broken toilet in cell 138. a fixture that the guards walked past every day, dismissing it as just another maintenance problem in an aging prison. They never looked closely enough to see what was really happening. That's the most shocking part of the story. Not that two men escaped from Alcatraz, but that they did it through such a simple, obvious weakness. The prison spent millions on security, built guard towers and fences, used the bay as a natural barrier. But they couldn't keep their toilets in good repair, and that oversight cost them their reputation as an inescapable fortress. Sometimes the biggest vulnerabilities are the ones we walk past every day without noticing. Sometimes freedom is just one broken toilet away. John Paul Scott understood that. He saw what others missed. And for one night in December 1962, he was free. That's the incredible true story of the only man to successfully escape Alcatraz and reach the mainland alive. If you enjoyed this story, make sure you're subscribed because we're covering more impossible escapes and shocking prison stories every week. Drop a comment below and let me know, would you have tried to swim across that freezing bay? Or would you have stayed in your cell? Check out our other videos on prison escapes, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.